So we had a researcher who was using ground penetrating radar, an anthropologist, and they said they had found depressions in the earth that seemed consistent with graves, but they didn't actually know. And we now have a narrative that tens of thousands of graves have been, not just graves, tens of thousands of bodies of children have been discovered. So far, not a single body. This is Shannon B. Douglas. This is While We Were Asleep. Been doing a almost daily video along my trip across the country. I spent several weeks in British Columbia. Visited with an old friend of mine who's a Cowichan traditional elder and knowledge keeper from Wolf Clan on Vancouver Island. He's a school trustee in Cowichan, and they're doing some new and interesting things with Indigenous education within the Cowichan community. And I also went north from there. Actually, my oldest friend in the world hosted me at his place for a few days in Nanaimo. And he runs a program called Blade Runners. And he's from Manitoba, from Swan River, as a matter of fact, originally. But we met when we were in 8th grade in Richmond, British Columbia. And because I moved around so much, and he was one of my earliest friends, he very much is my oldest friend. Now, this Blade Runner program actually works with the community, the Cowichan Indigenous community, and my friend Glenn organizes retreats that are about culture and about helping young Indigenous, particularly boys and young men, to remember some of the culture of their ancestors. And there's some irony there that a white guy is an organizer of this. So he organizes camps and retreats, and they bring elders to be able to give teachings and lessons to those kids in order to help remember some of their traditional stories, some of their traditional practices, some of their traditional hunting methods, and relations with the earth and the place. I went north from there to the Nass Valley, which is about 100 kilometers north of Terrace, BC. And I'm going to put up some of those videos. It looks like I might have a small documentary to share, and my conversations with George Mann helped to inform the frame for my book that I wrote, Chasing Quicksilver, about the nature of oral tradition and memory, and how that oral tradition and memory is passed on from generation to generation. I'm here at Cowasses First Nations in Saskatchewan, the community that announced the finding of 751 unmarked graves near the Maryville residential school site. And it made national news in 2021 because the assertion was that these were children buried by the residential schools. These are challenging assertions, and we have broadly accepted them on face as part of a narrative of European and white guilt, colonialism. And this has, even though I spent time in the 1990s, and even though I heard stories directly from dozens of Indigenous traditional people and Indigenous people who weren't practicing their tradition, who were from the Channeluth, Port Alberni area on Vancouver Island, Cowichan Nation on Vancouver Island, Shuswap territory in central British Columbia. Even though I heard those dozens of stories, and in the 90s I heard about assertions that there were unmarked graves in Kelowna. When the announcements of these grave sites were made, and the way in which they were made occurred last year, I felt very uncomfortable. I felt uncomfortable for a couple of reasons. One was 25 years ago, I wrote my honors thesis in the creative writing department at the University of British Columbia on relations between Indigenous and newcomers and a major standoff that occurred in British Columbia in 1995 called the Gustafson Lake Standoff. I tried to tell people, I tried to talk to people, I tried to publish about the things that happened in residential schools. And no one was listening. No one would listen. At the time, we had a liberal government. No one was listening. I contacted all kinds of various publications and tried to get my piece put up. And the conversation was just dead. And maybe that was just me, but no one was listening. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this narrative drops that there are discovered unmarked graves in Kelowna. And when you read the articles, they actually said, they didn't say unmarked graves. So we had a researcher who was using ground penetrating radar, an anthropologist, and they said they had found depressions in the earth that seemed consistent with graves, but they didn't actually know. And we now have a narrative that tens of thousands of graves have been, not just graves, tens of thousands of bodies of children have been discovered. So far, not a single body. Now, look, I'm not spitting on those graves, but extraordinary claims like this need better proof than what was actually stated by the researchers, that there were depressions in the ground that were perhaps consistent with graves. The site of the Gustafson Lake standoff in 1995 was at a place where in Shuswap's story, there is a mass grave of victims of smallpox, which, if I remember correctly, I'd have to go back to my notes to make this clear. What have we got? Hawks. I don't know if you can hear those, but I can hear them calling above me. It's pretty awesome. What a gift. Let's see if we can see them. With the camera, it's always a little bit funny. And I'm pointing into the sun. We're not going to see them. I lost my train of thought a little bit. We're talking about unmarked graves. Shuswap territory, mass grave. There are stories and knowledge passed down by generation that those graves were the result of smallpox due to trading of infected blankets and perhaps even a type of biological warfare on the frontier of colonization. Now, those horrors. I seem to have a pocket over here where the wind isn't too bad. Those horrors are part of human history. There were wars between Indigenous nations all over North America. In a book I read decades ago called 7 Arrows, there's a story it's the story of the Plains people. And the Plains people fought brutally against each other. And the only people of the Plains that weren't warring were the Hopi. The Hopi were actually known as the peacemakers. And when nations were warring and they didn't have a way of reconciliation, they would call upon the delegation of the Hopi to try and make peace because they were fighting each other. I told the story in another video. I don't know if it's up yet, but that's the story of Carson, Canyon City in the Nisga'a territory, where the women who were, when the Haida Raiders came, the women set up a scheme and they cut the penises off of the Haida Raiders by seducing them into their beds. So when we talk about things like people of European descent moving into British Columbia and having encounters with Indigenous, and there being war stories and stories of death, stories of fighting, these aren't exceptional to human history. These aren't this is our humanity. For my brothers and sisters of the Red Nation, and for my brothers and sisters of the White Nation, I pray that we can find a narrative on this that includes understanding, that includes a recognition of history, that includes a recognition that those people who came before us, some of them perpetrated horrors upon others. And that's a sad truth. I hope that we can understand that just like orphanages, just like mental institutions, just like Catholic day schools where boys were sexually abused by priests on a massive scale by Catholic priests, and those priests were hidden, they were shuffled around, they were known to be predators. I hope that we can recognize what I believe to be true, that before we had regulations, before we had controls, before we had oversight, before we had clear delineations of responsibility and accountability in these schools, that they were very, very attractive to predators. They attracted predators, and not everybody in those institutions were predators. Many of those people, the staff at the Indian residential schools, were Indigenous people themselves. As many as 30 or 40% in some schools were Indigenous people themselves. So I pray for all of us that we might find some truth in this narrative so that we can reach reconciliation at some point, so that we can reach peace amongst ourselves and with each other. And so that the narrative that we have to blame one party for historic guilt and sins can be released. I hope that we can let the children go. My name is Shannon B. Douglas. This is While We Were Asleep.